Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the West Shore Photography Club, to our regular bi-weekly meeting. Today is Monday, April the 20th, 2026, and we have a program this evening that's going to blow your socks off with Ian Plant with his outstanding visual design techniques. But more about Ian in a moment. This meeting is being recorded, and you will get a link in tomorrow's email. But before we start, we do have a couple of announcements. The TRIPS committee at the West Shore Photography Club met this week, and last week rather, excuse me, and we have come up with some trips in the future, and particularly one on June the 6th coming up quickly is Fort Indiantown Gap. And there's a military thing that they're doing there. So we're going to be taking the club there for a trip. There's about 3 or 4 other trips we have in the works, and none of them have been committed as of yet. But there is one trip that I wanted to chat with you about, and that is a potential for a kayak and canoe trip. Now, this is one that's going to be somewhat difficult if, in fact, we do it, because you will be having to get into a kayak or a canoe with your camera equipment and then travel along into some estuary, so to speak, and do some photography. It is not for the faint-hearted. The supplier, which would be the state of Pennsylvania, will provide the kayaks and the canoes, and it'll be about a 2-hour session. So since we have not done a trip of this nature, I wanted to ask you if you would participate in a chat poll. So I would like you to, on the chat, say yes, and yes meaning that you would consider going on a trip like this. No would mean, well, heck no, I'm not getting in a canoe, and that would be no. And then maybe would be, yes, we may consider doing that. So if you could go into chat and just say yes, no, or maybe, we would really appreciate it. And I can see one person, no, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, good response. As you're doing that, the reason why we're doing this, because we don't want to haul all the kayaks and the canoes to a location and have 2 or 3 people show up. That's the reason for asking this. Okay. So I think that's good. We got
Joe,
14
I
people
can't see where to respond.
on the chat. On the bottom, there's a chat. If you click on chat, you can type in something like yes or no.
I did, but I don't know where to type it in.
Well, let me see. No, I shouldn't have done that. I could, there's a bottom box, there's a chat, type a message here.
Sorry,
Well, George, just let me ask you, are you thinking about, would you want to go on that?
Yeah. Well, it depends, of course, on the date and the time.
Yeah, other than that, if it fit you, would you do that?
I'm putting in maybe.
Okay, maybe column. Good. Okay. Well, that's good. So let's move on to our program. George, don't worry about that. I'll mark that down as,
Okay.
That's not a commitment.
Okay,
That's just to give us some guidance. Going to start our program with Ian Plant, based in the Minneapolis area, and a wildlife and nature photographer. Actually, he's a photographer for everything. And from our vantage point, his key thing for us for this evening is how he does and crafts a visual flow and purely mastering the art of composition. And he's just going to blow us away. Been with him many times. So we are going to have questions you can ask on chat. And we'd like you to put the question in chat, and then we will ask at the appropriate time to Eon to answer the question. And of course, at the end, for sure, we'll have time to ask questions and chat with Ian. So I'm going to start it off with Ian. If you want to show your screen, we can go.
All right. Well, thank you, Joe. Yeah, not that you set the expectation for this presentation very high or anything like that. So hopefully I can live up to it. I think at one point Joe said that I'm going to knock your socks off. That's optional. You can keep your socks on if you would like. But if you want to take them off, please feel free to get comfortable. And tonight I'm going to talk about composition, about visual design and photography. And this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. I could talk about composition for hours, days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries. I promise not to keep you that long. But it is, in my opinion, the single most important thing you can do as a photographer. It's the one thing that's really completely under your control, especially if you're doing nature photography like me. Often you're at the mercy of the elements and you're out there photographing these beautiful scenes that have been sculpted by nature, or you're waiting for that, moment when the wildlife does something interesting. But the one thing that you're always in control of is what you decide to keep within the image frame and what to exclude, and where you position your camera. And that's going to have an effect on the arrangement of all the objects that are in your scene. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. Let me just click out a few things here and we'll get into my presentation on photography composition. And so I've been a full-time nature and landscape and wildlife pro for over 20 years now. And I'm going to talk about some of my favorite techniques for capturing artistic photographs. I love talking about the art of photography. To me, that's the whole point of what we're doing, is to create art. And if you've got any questions, as Joe said, you can put them in the chat. Joe, I'm hoping you'll monitor those questions. Feel free to interrupt if there's any question that it needs to be answered in real time. Otherwise, I can take some questions at the end. And if you want to see more of my work, check out my personal website, ianplant.com. And if you want to learn more from me, you can go to my photo education platform, which is photomasters.com, which has got a lot of free and premium resources to help you become the best photographer you could be, including a free online class that you can register for. And I put a link to that in the chat. It should be the very first item in the chat. And the lessons that I'm going to discuss tonight are some of the few lessons that are drawn from my Ultimate Photography Composition course, which includes my critically acclaimed ebook on composition called Visual Flow. And so visual flow is a concept, my way of thinking about visual design. The idea is to capture the viewer's attention and use visual elements within the picture space to lead the viewer where you want to lead them. And so stepping back for a moment before we delve into composition specifically, I think generally, if you want to make extraordinary photographs that stand out and get noticed, you should strive to go past making a mere documentary record with your photographs. So instead of just walking around taking snapshots of interesting things that you see, you take a mental step back and think about how you can inject your own personal creativity, your own artistic vision onto the scene or the subject that you're photographing. Really, what you are trying to do is to make photos that tell viewers as much about you as an artist as about the subject that you're photographing. And so what is composition? Well, at its most basic level, composition is a visual structure imposed upon an artistic expression. Or I should just say it's a structure imposed upon an artistic expression, because you can have composition in music, you can have composition in poetry, composition in performance art, and of course you can have it in painting and photography, which are visual artistic expressions. And so basically composition is what you include within the image frame and how you arrange the various visual elements within the picture frame. But more than that, a good composition should also tell a story about the subject. So with composition, you're trying to entice the viewer visually into the scene. You're trying to draw them in. But it's also good to be able to establish an emotional connection. You can do that through incorporating interesting story cues into your photographs, creative use of color and shadow and light, these are all part of composition, so I don't really view them as separate things. I view them as part of this process. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is going to be more of the bricks and mortar of visual design. So we're gonna focus on some of the more objective elements of composition, and I'm not going to talk as much about the whole storytelling and emotion triggering part of things. But that is an important part of the composition process. And ultimately, you're inviting viewers to see the world through your eyes. And so, this photo taken in the Redwood Forest of California is a good example. So, I was using strong visual design techniques. I've got a lot of bold, dynamic, diagonal lines in this image, and they have a lot of visual energy and get the eye moving. And there's also multiple visual elements that attract the viewer's eye, and that's also going to facilitate and encourage the viewer's movement throughout the composition. It's going to create visual tension between these multiple elements, but also the fog and the sun shining through it that helps add a little bit of mystery and tell a bit of a story and trigger an emotional response as well as a visual response. So a good composition should have all of this. And I think that it's fair to say that with anything related to photography, Ansel Adams said it first, said it best, and he said it in 8 words or less. And so here's a quote from Ansel Adams that I think sums up everything that I'm talking about right now. You don't take a photograph, you make it. You're not just pointing your camera at interesting things and taking a picture. You're thinking critical about the moment to take the photo, about the design elements and how they're relating to one another and how they're going to interact with the viewer. And you're making an artistic expression rather than just taking a photograph. And it all starts with shapes. Shapes are the building blocks of successful compositions. And I say that one must learn to see and recognize shapes to become a better photographer. And this seems a little odd. It's kind of a weird thing to say because we all know what shapes are. We learn about shapes when we're very young. But as we get older, we kind of forget those early lessons. And we don't really think of the world in terms of the shapes that are created by objects. But if you want to be good at composition, you've got to start thinking about the world in terms of the shapes that things create. And what you're really learning to do is to see those shapes from your childhood when you first learned about these simple, graphic, bold shapes like circles and squares and triangles and other things like lines and curves and spirals. These simple shapes are what you should be looking for when you are assembling your compositions. A composition really is just finding these shapes, getting them to play nicely together. And so, for example, this photograph taken in the Arizona desert relies on 3 primary shapes. So first you've got the curving shape. You can think of it as an oval or a circle or as just like a curve or an S curve. That shape of that white sandstone swirl in the foreground. That's the first shape. And then you've got the triangle shape formed by the sandstone feature in the background. And then you've got the clouds that are creating these diagonal lines in the sky. And these diagonal lines all working together, creating this radial shape in the sky. And so really this composition is about these 3 basic shapes working together. That triangle in the background acts like a point of interest, which pulls the viewer to the background. And then the other shapes lead the viewer to that spot, that place of primary importance in the composition. So the curve in the foreground and the radial pattern in the sky all point towards that triangle in the background. And so when I'm talking about shapes, I'm not talking about this in a very literal way. I'm thinking instead of these basic abstract shapes. And so this is a photograph I took in the Alaskan Arctic of a polar bear backlit by the setting sun. Very contrasty scene. So I chose to underexpose the image so that I didn't overexpose any of the highlights of the rimlet bear. And I let most of the scene and the bear itself fall into silhouette. So all you can really see is the outline of the bear. When I'm talking about shapes, though, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like a bear shape versus a person shape. What I'm talking about is those basic shapes. And so really, this polar bear is made up of a bunch of those basic shapes. You've got the triangle shape that forms its head, and the legs are forming these lines. And there's even the curve formed by the rump of the bear. So there's all of these constituent shapes that make up that bigger bear shape. And when I'm thinking about composition, I'm thinking about these simpler shapes. And one cool thing about shapes in photography is that as you change your position relative to an object, you can change its shape. And so the following three photos are a very literal example of this. This is a photo of a feature in the Utah desert, and the next two photos are of the same feature, but from different positions. So as you go around this feature, from one angle, it's got this sort of broad triangle shape. From another angle, it looks more boxy, like a shoebox almost. The shape's a little less attractive, in my opinion. And from a third angle, it's got this sharper pointed triangle shape. So it's the same feature, its shape changes as you move around it. So you can choose your position to find the most visually dynamic shape for an object. But when I'm talking about manipulating the shape of objects, I'm thinking of something a little less literal than just moving around this big mesa. I'm thinking of something a bit more abstract and artistic. And so the following two photos, I think, will better illustrate what I'm talking about. So this is a photo looking straight down at some cracked mud in the Utah desert. And from this flat looking straight down perspective, these cracks in the mud they're irregular, but they're actually a bit more regular than being completely irregular. They're roughly the same size. They've all got the same sort of squarish or rectangular shape. And so there's less variation between the shapes. And this is a kind of an interesting pattern image. But notice what happens when I get low to the ground with a wide angle lens and change my perspective. So I'm no longer looking straight down at these mud cracks. Instead, I'm looking at them from an angle with a wide angle lens, and I'm really, really close to some of these cracks that are closest to me. Suddenly, their shapes get completely transformed. They get stretched out. The closer the object is to the lens, the bigger it's going to look. This is known as perspective distortion, and it's completely natural. It's not a lens defect. Anything that's closer is going to look bigger than the same size object farther away. And of course, you see this when let's say you go to a basketball game and you're sitting up in the nosebleed section of the bleachers. The people that are right in front of you look a lot bigger than the players on the court way, way, way down below. That's perspective distortion. And with wider angles of view, perspective distortion gets greatly exaggerated and amplified. So here, those mud cracks that looked more or less regular from the top-down look suddenly become very irregular. So the cracks that are at the very bottom of the image frame, those are closest to the lens, look a lot bigger than the cracks that are farther away. And so those mud cracks get smaller and smaller as they recede into the distance. In fact, the mud cracks in the foreground, that one big crack that's in the middle of the bottom of the image frame is now as big, if not bigger, than the mesa in the background. And by the way, this is the same mesa from the previous photos. Once again, a different angle on this. And by getting low and close to one edge of a cracked mud tile, I take advantage of that perspective distortion. The shape of that kind of stretches out. It no longer looks kind of squarish. It looks more like a triangle with the top end pointing up from the foreground to the background. So now it becomes this dynamic compositional shape that a triangle creates these two diagonal lines that are converging. And so if you got one of the pointy ends of the triangle sticking up, those two converging lines are going to help lead the viewer up towards the point of interest in the background. So I do this a lot with my landscape photos, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we get deeper into the presentation. And so here are some examples of compositions that I've taken that are shape-based, though actually all of my compositions are shape-based on one level or another. But I just wanted to share some of the ways I was thinking about shapes and making these compositions. So this first photo is a drone photo I took in Greenland. I was off the coast of Greenland on a boat, flying my drone to photograph the icebergs that were drifting in the bay. And this one iceberg had this big arch that had been carved out by erosion from waves as it's floating in the ocean. And so the shape of the arch, that curve, I knew I wanted to feature that because it's a very simple, bold shape, but I also wanted to repeat that shape. And so you actually see multiple times where that shape is repeated. Starting off, there was some ice flows that had basically blocks of ice that had fallen off the iceberg and they were floating and they created this curving pattern. And I incorporated those into the composition because I knew that they would mirror that curve of the arch. So they would introduce that shape and repeat it. And then, of course, the shape's repeated again with the light that's shining through the arch hitting the backside of the iceberg, which is mostly in shadow. And so shapes can be created by the actual shape of an object. They can be created by the interaction of shadow and light or the juxtaposition of colors. So there's different ways you can incorporate shapes into your composition. So this is a composition that studies this repeating shape. And there's a few other examples of that curving shape repeated. If you look at some of the texture in the iceberg above the arch, you can see that that texture is also recreating that curving shape. So multiple times you've got that curve repeated over and over again. And this is a very simple shape-based composition. I was photographing orangutans in Borneo in Indonesia, and I saw this infant clinging to its mother. And so I zoomed in really tight because I loved the abstract shape created by the body of the infant orangutan. So if you start in the lower right and follow the orangutan's shoulder blade past the elbow up to its hand, it creates this very simple S curve shape. And that S curve helps guide the viewer through the entire composition, starting in the lower right, eventually ending up in the upper left. But because it curves, zigzags back and forth, you actually get the viewer exploring more parts of the composition. And so good compositional shapes will guide the viewer throughout the composition. And so you're always looking for those simple shapes that the viewer will intuitively see and follow with their eyes. And so here the shapes are getting a little bit more complex. This is a drone photo I took in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. And I was flying there in winter. I was photographing the sand dunes, but it was cloudy that morning. There was no light on the dunes. And you really need that light on the dunes. And I'll explain that why later on. So we'll just table that for right now. And so I was looking for something else to photograph, and I saw this frozen river, and it had these nice curves in it. So I flew the drone up and down the river until I found this spot that had the most curves. So this really dynamic zigzag of curves that are leading from foreground to background. So they start in the lower right and bring the eye up to the upper left. There are other compositional shapes here that are working with that zigzaggy S-curve shape. You've got the lines that are created by the line of dunes, the horizon line in the background, and also the diagonal lines of the shapes of the clouds. And all of these shapes are working together to lead to that point of interest in the background, which is the sun rising in the background. And if everyone could mute on their end, we're getting a little bit of background noise. That would be great. Thank you so much. And so the shapes are working together. You've got the leading shapes that are pushing the viewer's eye to the point of interest. And then that bright sun star, that's the sun just rising above the cloud. And I used a small aperture to get that diffraction spike effect. That bright part of the composition is pulling the viewer's eye. Anything that's relatively bright or colorful is going to attract the viewer to that spot. So the shapes are working together to bring the viewer to that most important part of the composition. Here is another example. This is a drone photo I took in the Utah desert. And so I had scouted this location. I was looking on Google Maps to find a part of the river that had a really nice horseshoe bend. And when I saw this, I'm like, okay, I got to fly my drone over this. I really love the shape that's created. And so you actually have, once again, a repetition of the shapes. This curving shape of the river is actually first on the canyon rim above the river, and then it's repeated again within the river. And both of those shapes are leading the eye to that bright spot at the top of the image. So I took this photo at sunset. The sun was setting in the background, and I adjusted my drone camera so that the sun was just outside of the image frame. I didn't want the sun in the picture itself, but I wanted the flare from the sun to be at the very top of the image frame. So it's this bright area, which is the point of interest in the background that's pulling the viewer's eye to that spot. And the repetition of shapes, both of those shapes lead to that bright halo at the top of the image frame. Okay, so here you can see the shapes are getting more complex. This is a wide angle photograph I took in Indonesia. I was on the island of Sumatra trekking for orangutans, and I was taking a break and I sat down, and this Thomas's leaf monkey came down from a nearby tree and sat down right next to me on this vine. So it was a thrilling close encounter. This little guy seemed perfectly comfortable with me, and I could choose any lens I wanted. Because he was so close, I chose a wide angle lens. Actually, I chose a fisheye lens on purpose for a very good reason. I loved the curving shape of the vine that the monkey was sitting on. I knew that that would be a really important part of my composition. And I also knew that a fisheye lens, because of its inherent barrel distortion, was going to accentuate that curve, make it bigger, bolder, more prominent. And it was also going to curve the tree trunks that were away from the center of the image. So I did that for a very good reason. So I've got that strong curve of that vine that's leading the eye from bottom right up into the upper left of the image. And then that curve gets continued by the curving tree trunks. And so you can see that, especially that trunk on the right side of the image, swings the eye back down. And so these two shapes working together sort of frame the central part of the composition, frame the main subject. They get the viewer exploring those parts of the composition, but ultimately leading the eye back to the beginning. And so with a wide angle composition, you're bringing in a lot of visual elements. There can be a lot of visual chaos if you don't do it right. And so that's why you need these really bold shapes to help cut through the chaos and simplify the composition, give the viewer something to glob onto. And that's also why I get really close to my foreground elements with a wide angle lens, make it big and bold so it stands out. So here, the foreground is really the monkey itself. And so even though these other shapes lead the eye to different parts of the composition, with that bold foreground and with the way the shapes are working, the eye is always coming back to the beginning. And if you can do that, if you can get the viewer's eye back to the beginning where they start their visual journey all over again, you're going to trap the viewer's interest over the long run. And that is what creates a successful composition. Now, there are other shapes in this composition that are also working to do things to lead the viewer's eye. Like you've got the leading line created by the monkey's tail, which is pointing from the lower right up to the monkey. You've got its line of sight, creating an implied compositional line. You got the triangle formed by the tree behind it, but it's those curves that are the primary shapes that are doing most of the work. And one of my favorite places to photograph in the world is Badlands National Park in South Dakota. And I love this place because there's so much color and texture in the landscape itself. You've got these soft claystone formations that are being eroded, and you've got these multiple layers in the claystone, and each layer's got a different color. And so you can find a rainbow of colors in the claystone and some amazing shapes created by the erosion. And then during the summer, you get these stunning sunset and sunrise skies because there are these massive thunderstorms raking the Great Plains during the summer months. And so I've seen some of the most amazing sunrises and sunsets and more rainbows in Badlands National Park compared to anywhere else I've photographed in the world. And so you can create compositions that bring the shapes in the sky together with the shapes in the landscape. So here's a scene where it rained for 20 minutes at sunset, and then the sun came out. So a rainbow appeared, some beautiful golden hour light on the clouds, on the rainbow, on the background scenery. And because of the curve of the rainbow, I really wanted to bring that curve into the foreground. So I looked around for a foreground shape, and then I found this white stripe in the claystone, creating this really bold leading curve that mirrors, reflects the curve formed by the rainbow above. So these shapes are working together to get the viewer exploring multiple parts of the composition, but they're also leading to one another. And so that's what I'm always looking for, is for the shapes to interact. And I do that with my landscape photos, which I can usually think about more. I can be more thoughtful. When I'm doing wildlife, I'm looking for it as well. And sometimes with wildlife, I might be noticing it later on. In the moment, I might just be like firing off my shutter like crazy. One such example was when I recently went to do some underwater photography in Baja in Mexico, and I went for the annual sardine run, which has got all of these migrating sardine and mackerel forming these huge schools of fish, and these predators, mainly marlin and sea lion, come to hunt the fish. And so this is one of the compositions that I photographed. And I really like this because of the repetition and mirroring of the shapes. You've got the curving shape that's formed by the marlin in the foreground. That shape is repeated by the curve of the sea lion that's piercing the bait ball. As the fish swim away from the sea lion, they are creating a curve that mirrors those shapes. And then that curve is repeated several times in the reflection in the water above. And so I'm just always looking for these opportunities to get my shapes to work together and to lead the eye. Actually, those shapes created a progression that leads the eye from bottom to top in the composition. And here's another example. This is a coyote backlit by the rising sun in Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico. And the coyote is forming this curving shape. And that curve is repeated by the shadows that are on the bushes in the background. And there's another big shadow up at the top. And so multiple curves creating a visual progression from bottom to top, foreground to background, and each shape nests the other shape. And this idea of nesting shapes is actually very important to my philosophy of composition. My good friend and mentor, landscape photographer George Stocking, once said that the world is a visual puzzle, and the job of the photographer is to solve that puzzle. Basically, the idea is you've got to put all of the puzzle pieces out there in the world together so that you make a coherent composition that makes sense for the viewer. And so I often think of when I'm trying to figure out where to set up my camera to get that perfect perspective to align all the shapes, thinking about it in terms of this being a bunch of puzzle pieces. And here's a good example. I made this photo. It's a drone photo on the coast of Norway. And I had this beautiful fjord with these wonderful mountains, some nice golden hour light on the mountains, some beautiful clouds. And I had this empty space in the fjord, just water, some reflection, but mostly just water. And so I wanted to find a shape to nest within that empty space. So I flew around until I saw this island, which had a really dynamic shape. And I selected a position for my drone so that island was perfectly nested within the fjord, and so that it didn't visually overlap with any of the mountains reflected in the water to the left or the right. If I had done that, if I had had that visual overlap, I wouldn't have been nesting that shape perfectly within. I would have had problems with the composition. It wouldn't have been successful. And that leads me to our next topic, our next bucket of this way of thinking about composition. And that is visual separation. And so separation is actually really important in photography for reasons that I'll go into in just a moment. And here's an example of that. This is a aerial photo, a drone photo I took of some white pelicans here in Minnesota, about 45 minutes away from my house. I'm waiting right now for the white pelicans to come back so I can do more of this type of photography. And what attracted me to this was I had this cluster of 7 pelicans, and 6 were forming a ring around the one pelican in the middle. And so none of the pelicans are overlapping. They're all perfectly separated. And that's creating this really wonderful shape, that circle that's framing the central pelican. And then I just had to wait for that central pelican to strike a pose that would create a dynamic shape. And so why is separation important? Well, pretty simple. We live in a three-dimensional world, and as human beings, we perceive the world in 3 dimensions. But when you take a photograph, you lose depth. A photograph is 2-dimensional. And so objects that seem separate to us in our 3D vision will appear to visually merge in 2 dimensions if they are overlapping. And so when you're out there making photos, when you see objects that are close and far away, you know, because you can perceive depth, that they are different objects. So your brain sort of visually separates them for you. But when you squish the world down to 2 dimensions, if those objects are overlapping, they're going to look like they've merged together and create a single shape. They're creating a single object. And anyone who's ever taken a photo of someone outside, done any outside portraiture, knows this is the dreaded tree growing out of the head problem. If you select a position where there's a tree behind your main subject's head, it's going to look like that tree is growing out of that person's head. So you learn early on to choose a background that doesn't have a tree that's right behind the person's head. And so visual separation is a really important part of photography composition. One of those things that you've got to teach yourself to see, because if you're not paying attention to it, you miss these visual mergers all the time, and they can really limit the impact of your photos. If you want clean, concise compositions, you need to think about separation. But there's actually several ways to think about this. So one is separation itself, making sure that you have visual objects that are distinct, that don't overlap. And so this is another photo of a white pelican. This is from the land with a telephoto lens. And it caught a fish and it was flipping the fish around so it could swallow it. And so I made sure to fire my motor drive really fast because I wanted to get a moment where the fish was perfectly nested within the open beak of the pelican. If the fish had overlapped with either the upper or the lower part of the beak or both, then this would have been less effective. Having it separated, physically separated from the beaks was essential. It was critical. But another way to think about this is instead of looking for visual separation, look for convergence. So convergence is when objects or shapes come together. And where those objects come together, that can be a really powerful part of the composition. You can think of, for example, this photograph of these two zebras in Namibia that are coming down to drink from a water hole. They're converging. You can think of them as two diagonal lines, thinking of them as that simple abstract shape that they create. So instead of seeing a zebra shape, you see instead two diagonal lines that are converging, or you see a V shape, or the zebra are creating a triangle. And so that convergence focuses the viewer's attention on that place where the shapes come together, and that becomes a really powerful part of the composition. And then finally, you can think of taking convergence to the next level and look for overlap. Overlap occurs when you've got objects overlapping each other. And when they overlap, they tend to visually merge. The viewer tends to think of them as a single shape rather than as distinct shapes. And the overlapping objects can actually create their own shape. And so here, for example, these king penguins are overlapping quite a bit. And so together, they actually form this diagonal line or some sort of diagonal shape. And so I'll talk a little bit more about overlap a little bit later. But let's focus on separation, because I think this is the most challenging thing for most people. 95% of the time, you are going to be looking to separate objects as much as you can. And so that's where you should focus most of your attention. Once you've mastered separation, you can start thinking about convergence and overlap and using them creatively. And so a classic example of a scene where separation is critical is if you're photographing a grove of trees. If you stand in the wrong place, the trees might be all clumped up and you don't get any interesting patterns emerging. The trees just all seem to visually merge. But if you move around, you can usually find that position where the tree trunks spread out, where they're separated from one another. And so instead of this clump of trees, you've got a pattern of these vertical lines. I don't have any good pictures of living trees, but I've got some nice pictures of dead trees that illustrate this point. This is a composition from the dead fly of Namibia. And I wanted to focus the composition on this pattern of trees, but I had to very carefully choose my position to separate the trees as much as I could from one another. Now you'll notice there are 3 trees in the lower left that are overlapping. I couldn't quite get them completely separated, but that's okay, because even if the viewer visually merges them and thinks of them as one shape, that one shape is part of the overall pattern. So you still have a pattern of all these different trees. So a little bit of visual overlap can often be okay. It's not something that's critical to always get rid of. Just remember, if you do have that visual overlap, the viewer might tend to view those overlapping objects as one single object. And so if you can work that into your composition, more power to you. Now, there's another thing going on. So the visual separation was a very important part of this composition, but perspective distortion was important as well. If you're creating a pattern image, it's nice to introduce an anomaly to break up the pattern because that will be where the viewer focuses their attention. And so I broke up the pattern here by the tree in the middle. It's a lot bigger than the other trees, and it wasn't actually any bigger than the rest of the trees. It's just a lot closer to my lens for this composition. I did that very much on purpose to create that anomaly to break up the pattern. Also, I just like how all the tree trunks are converging, creating these converging diagonal lines. So actually that tree trunk in the middle is creating this really bold, either triangle shape or V shape, or you can think of it as a radial shape where a bunch of diagonal lines are converging. That really bold shape is the centerpiece of this composition, and the pattern is helping to get the eye moving into different areas of the composition. Okay, so here is a photo I took in Antarctica. This is a Weddell seal. And I wish I had a version of this done the wrong way. It's just that I've trained myself to look for these visual mergers that I very rarely accidentally photograph them anymore. And so I just don't have a good counterexample. But basically, I was with a tour group, and I was working with a bunch of clients, and we were photographing this seal, and it was laying down, sleeping, and every now and then it would just look up. And when it looked up, it was creating this really nice curving shape that I knew could be really nice for the composition. But unfortunately, when it looked up, its head was coming up with those stones right behind it. And so you got these kind of gray brownish stones, you got this gray brownish seal. As soon as the seal's head intersected with the stones, it kind of disappeared. It visually merged with the stones in the background. Looked like the seal had its head cut off. And so I told everyone, look, we've got to find a position where there's going to be something other than stone behind the seal's head when it looks up. And so I saw this little bit of snow that was on the rocks. And so we set up so that when the seal looked up, the seal's head would be perfectly framed by that snow that's cascading down the rocks. And that created the visual separation that was necessary for this composition to be successful. Without it, it just wouldn't have worked at all. It may seem like a little thing, but sometimes the little things make a big difference. And so here you can see, instead of just zooming in on the subject, I go a little bit wider. I'm bringing in the landscape in the background and also the storm cloud above. That storm cloud's creating this really nice curving shape, which actually mirrors the curve created by the seal. So usually I'm not going for super simple compositions. I'm trying to build something that's a bit more of a rich, complex visual design. And to do that, to bring in more visual information to avoid chaos, you've got to think very carefully how the shapes interact with one another. And so I mentioned earlier that light and shadow can create visual separation. And I was talking earlier about how sand dunes require light. When I was showing you that image from Mongolia earlier on, that drone image of the frozen river. And so this is why you need angled light on sand dunes to reveal the shapes and the textures. Because when you've got flat overcast light, or in the middle of the day when the light's just striking down on the dunes, you lose these shapes. So sunrise and sunset is great for sand dunes. It adds a lot of golden color to the dunes, but it creates the layers of shadow and light because of the low angled light. And that reveals the shapes and the textures. That's what allows you to get a photograph like this, where you can get a pattern going from bottom to top in the composition, leading the eye deeper in. And you can also achieve visual separation by juxtaposing different colors. This is a drone photo I made over the volcano in Iceland that's been erupting on again, off again over the past few years. And I was very careful about the timing of this in two ways. One, the volcano was erupting every few minutes. And so I wanted to make sure that when the volcano started erupting, my drone got out of there as quickly as possible because I didn't want to destroy my drone. And two, I wanted to introduce some color contrast in this image to help separate out the shapes. So I made this photo at twilight. I knew then that the landscape would be bathed in this cool twilight blue, which would juxtapose really nicely against the warm tones of the lava. And so,
wow.
And so the shapes emerge in part because of the color contrast. So first of all, you got this ring of blue around the crater rim, and then there's a ring of orange yellow, which is the lava on the crater rim, and that is framing the next shape, which is a circle of the lava lake, which is mostly dark. And that is nested within that is another circle of red, and then nested within that is a little splash of yellow, that little yellow circle in the middle. So you've got these concentric rings. It's kind of like a Russian nesting doll. Each shape frames the next smaller shape, and so on and so on. And the color contrast really helps tease those shapes out. Here's an example of luminosity and color contrast working together. This is a telephoto image I took of the Grand Tetons. It was a really nice morning. There was fog down below the mountains and these stormy clouds behind the mountains. And at sunrise, you had this golden light hitting the clouds and the peaks of the mountains. But the mist was in shadow, and some parts of the clouds were in shadow as well. And that's creating these alternating layers of blue and gold and of light and dark. So shadows are creating luminosity as well as color contrast. Anything that's in shadow is going to tend to be cooler. And so this is a really great way of creating color contrast. Shooting at sunrise or sunset when you've got golden light on parts of the landscape, any part that's in shadow will be rendered as a cooler tone. And that nice color contrast can help enhance visual separation. And here are some shots from the Great Cypress Bayou in East Texas. I go down there every year to lead photo tours in November during peak autumn color. I take my clients out on my own personal motorboat and we explore the bayou. It's one of the most hauntingly beautiful places in the world. It's also very visually chaotic. You got lots of fall foliage and cypress trees and Spanish moss and reflections. And so you got to think a lot about visual separation. So here are 3 shots from the bayou, each showing a different visual separation strategy. So the first one is color separation. I saw these brightly colored cypress leaves that were turning a brilliant reddish orange color, and they're creating kind of a curving shape that's reflected in the water. And so that shape emerges from the splash of red. If you tie all of the red together, it's creating that curving shape. And that red stands out from the cooler tones in the background. So that defines the shape despite this being visually chaotic. Fog is another great way of creating some visual separation when you're doing nature scenes, because the fog will reduce visual acuity for things in the background. And so stuff in the foreground will stand out more. And so the splash of color in the foreground on this one tree and the fog diffusing the background help the shape of that tree stand out from the background, reducing the visual chaos, enhancing visual separation. And then here I'm using light and shadow. So there's some sunset light hitting this one cypress tree that's away from the shore. The shore itself, I made sure to select a position where the shore in the background was in shade to enhance that contrast. If this had all been shot in the same light, that tree would not be standing out. But because the background is in shadow, it really pops out. That creates the visual separation that is necessary for the success of this composition. And so we've talked about visual separation a lot because it's the most difficult thing for people to notice. You really got to train yourself to see these overlaps and avoid them. But as I said earlier on, convergence and overlap are strategies you can use as well. There are no rules of composition. There are only tools that you can use. And so if anyone ever says, well, there's a rule of visual separation, I think that's completely wrong. That's why I don't like referring to these as rules. They're just tools you can use. And sometimes you use a tool that does the opposite of that so-called photography rule. And so here's an example where I intentionally introduced overlap into my composition. I was photographing a family of mountain gorillas in Uganda, and they were all kind of arrayed on this hillside. And at first I was trying to find a position that was separating the gorillas out, but I didn't like that. And so then I moved into a position that created overlap of the gorillas. Each gorilla is just a little bit overlapping the gorilla that's next in line behind it. And I did this on purpose because it created this really dynamic C curving shape in this composition that leads the eye from foreground to background, from the lower right to the upper left. And that shape emerges from the overlap of those gorillas. So usually I'm trying to get visual separation, but sometimes I'm thinking instead about intentionally using overlap as a compositional tool. And now we're ready to talk about the final bucket of things to think about when you're thinking about visual design. These are kind of the three critical things that I think about the most when I'm making compositions, and that's motion and energy. Of course, you have to create the illusion of motion and energy, just like you have to create the illusion of depth in your photographs. Photographs are two-dimensional, there's no depth. If you choose a dynamic composition, you can give the viewer this feeling of depth. Same thing with energy and motion. Doesn't matter what you photograph, doesn't matter what your shutter speed is. The end result is always completely static and not moving. To give your photo a sense of motion and energy, you have to create the illusion of that, and you do that through composition, choosing dynamic shapes and visual elements. One way to think about this is that you're building stepping stones into your compositions, a path that will lead the viewer, a visual progression that will draw them in. Getting the viewer's eye moving around is the key to creating that illusion of energy, of motion. And you'll notice with my landscape compositions, a lot of my wildlife compositions as well, I'm usually creating a progression that goes from foreground to middle ground to background, maybe even to sky above that. I'm using the shapes working together to get the viewer exploring the image. And so this illusion of depth and this illusion of motion are actually tied together. They're actually the same thing. They're just different ways of thinking about the same thing. You create depth in your photographs to give the viewer a sense of being there, of drawing them in. And that also creates the illusion of motion and energy. So here's a drone photo I took in Iceland. I was flying over these hills that had all this volcanic ash on them, and the erosion of the hills was revealing all these interesting shapes. And so I used those dynamic shapes to create this visual progression from foreground to middle ground to background to sky. And so here's an example of this. This was taken in Olympic National Park in Washington State. And I had the sea stack as my point of interest in the background. But all of the other shapes in this composition are all pushing the eye to that sea stack in the background. So you've got all of the diagonal lines created by the ripples in the sand in the foreground. You've even got the horizon line coming in from the left and the right, and then the diagonal shapes formed by the clouds. So all of these are pushing into that central part of the composition, creating this radial array, this radial shape that's very dynamic because of all the converging diagonal lines. Very energetic image as a result. And your use of color can also create visual energy in your compositions. Like warm, bold colors are very energetic. So that can create a sense of motion and energy as well. And here's a scene from Death Valley National Park. I drove up one of the roads in the park that go up into the mountains, and I'm looking back down, and there's this sandstorm raging in the dunes below, and there's this thunderstorm raging in the sky above. And I could have just zoomed in tight on the storm, just the sandstorm, or maybe the sandstorm and the storm clouds. But I really felt like that was a pretty flat perspective. It wasn't giving me a sense of depth, and it wasn't giving the image as much visual energy as I wanted. So instead of zooming in, I zoomed out, and I stood in the middle of the road and used the road to create these bold converging diagonal lines, these strong leading lines that push the viewer from foreground to background. They really propel the viewer into the background parts of the scene. So much more visual energy and a sense of depth. Here's an example from Antarctica of using shapes that are pointing in different directions to create visual tension in the composition. That's going to create visual energy. And so here I've got this penguin that was walking up this hill. It was a steep hill. Every now and then it would stop to take a rest and kind of turn and look down the hill before it would turn back around and keep going up. And so I've got the shadow behind the penguin, creating this really strong leading line. And I made sure to give it lots of visual runway so it would get more energy. So I put the leading line in the lower left and the penguin up in the upper right. And then you've got the countervailing visual energy created by the penguin's beak pointing the other way, and its flipper pointing the other way, and even its line of sight creating that implied compositional line. So those lines are all moving in the opposite direction. And they're actually bringing the eye back to where it started with the hopes that the composition will get the viewer starting their visual journey all over again, just creating that sort of circular motion, like it's a current that brings the viewer throughout the composition and then comes back to the beginning and starts it all over again. So when you have that visual opposition, you can create a lot of visual energy in your compositions. And here is a photo that seems pretty tranquil. This is an infant Sumatran orangutan clinging to its mother. The mother is swinging by on a bunch of trees and vines. So she's going past me where I was on the trail. And I shot this with a fisheye lens. I loved working with a fisheye lens in the rainforest. I just loved the way it made all the trees look curvy. I thought that that made the composition more interesting. Those curving trees are just framing the central parts of the composition. And so her direction of motion and line of sight is implied. It's creating this implied movement from right to left. And so what pulls the viewer back to the starting point is that eye contact with the infant. It creates this point of interest. And so you've got the visual motion going one way and then bringing the eye back. And I think it's something, especially with camera clubs, you get drilled into your head that you should always simplify your compositions. Just zoom in on the main subject and make it all about that. And that's a good lesson for when you're first starting out. And I think that rule of simplicity, though I prefer to call it the tool of simplicity, is useful to learn. But I like making complex compositions. And the complex compositions, when they work, are, I think, going to be more interesting for the viewer over the long haul. They're going to hold the viewer's interest over a longer period of time. So I like having that more long-term relationship with the viewer whenever I can. And so, there's all the curving trees. Those are also acting to get the viewer's eye exploring different parts of this composition. Having multiple parts of the composition that the viewer is attracted to is what's going to create that long-term interest. But you always need to make sure that the viewer goes back to the beginning, back to that visual anchor, which is what I call it, that primary visual element that is going to start their journey and also be where the journey ends. So here, I think it's that infant's face because of the power of that eye contact. And here's another example of visual opposition. Whenever I can, I like to get visual elements in a diagonal arrangement rather than a vertical or a horizontal one because it's more energetic. And so here's a lion in Kenya that I photographed at twilight and just a little bit of a spotlight on the lion. And I chose the moment when it let out a mighty roar. Okay, you got me. It's a mighty yawn. But when you're photographing big cats and you actually see them roar, it's not nearly as interesting or as dynamic as a mighty yawn. So that's usually what I'm going for. And so for this composition, the twilight blue is actually a gap in the clouds. And that gap in the clouds was more in the upper left. So I put the lion in the lower right. And so the two are in this subtle diagonal visual opposition. And I call this a counterpoint arrangement when you've got two objects that are juxtaposed opposite of each other in a composition. And if you can juxtapose them opposite diagonally, I think it's just going to be more interesting. A vertical line takes the viewer from bottom to top, a horizontal line takes the viewer from left to right, but a diagonal line takes the viewer, from bottom to top and from right to left, or vice versa. So it actually gets the viewer exploring more of the composition. And here is another example of how the shapes working together create a visual progression for the viewer that creates this illusion of depth and motion. So this is a scene from Patagonia in Chile. And I had this really beautiful curving shape of the cloud. And so I waited for a moment when one of the incoming waves created a shape that mirrored that curving shape. And so these two curves are mirroring one another. And they don't actually connect, but the viewer is going to tend to kind of fill in the gaps. If you do that, you can see that these two curving shapes that mirror each other are creating this S curve. And that is the path for the viewer. Those are the visual stepping stones for the viewer, starting in the lower left, winding the viewer through the composition, ultimately ending up in the upper right. And I also like working with shapes that move back and forth. So S curves, zigzags can be very dynamic. And so in this composition, another drone photo of that Iceland volcano, you can see the zig and the zag created by the lava. And then there's another zig that's created by the sun setting in the background. Because it's so bright, it's going to draw the viewer's eye from the crater over to the sun. So you can see that zigzag zig. And that's a very dynamic shape that gets the viewer exploring many different parts of the composition. And the warm color cast is also injecting a lot of visual energy into the composition. Here's a photo I took off the coast of Namibia. I saw a bunch of flamingos off the coast and they were all sleeping. And it was near sunset, so there's a little bit of color in the water. And I decided to render the scene mostly in silhouette. And I liked the pattern of the flamingos, but I didn't want to just photograph the flamingos. So I noticed that there were these salt marshes. And so I selected a position. So the salt marshes were creating this visual progression, these stepping stones, starting at the bottom of the image, working their way up to the top to the pelicans, or the flamingos, rather. Sorry. And I noticed that the visual progression of the salt marshes really kind of starts in the lower left and is pushing more to the upper right. And so because of that visual progression, I wanted to have one of the flamingos, sorry, yes, flamingos. I keep on mixing up flamingos and pelicans. I'm sorry, flamingos. One of the flamingos looking up to break the pattern. I wanted one of the flamingos to be an anomaly that would attract the viewer's eye. But because of that visual progression of the salt marshes, it had to be that flamingo and only that flamingo. So I waited for like 10 or 15 minutes until that was the only flamingo that was looking up because it completes the visual progression. And here's an example of a composition that's got a lot of visual energy. And it's because of the bold diagonal lines that are in this composition. You've got the shapes formed by the shadow and light on the clouds, creating this diagonal array. And so I intentionally chose a foreground that mirrored those shapes. So I have these erosion lines in the soft clay stone that are creating these converging diagonal lines. So very bold radial composition. And also the beautiful sunset colors, like the whole sky just lit up golden and that light was reflecting down onto the landscape. So all that golden color is very energetic as well. So when people see this photo, they ask me all the time, wow, was that a long exposure? And I say, no, absolutely not. It was a short exposure. There's no movement. The length of the exposure doesn't matter to how much energy your image has. It's just that when you do long exposures, there might be some blurring of elements like clouds, for example, or water, that if you were lucky, that blurring can create some dynamic shapes. But you can also get those dynamic shapes when you're using short exposures. So it is the dynamic shapes that make this look to a lot of people like it's a long exposure photograph when it's not. Okay, so the final image I'm going to share in this presentation, and then I'm happy to answer any questions, was taken in the Cofa Mountains of Arizona. And you can see all of the lessons I've been talking about coming together in this one image. So I got low and close with a wide angle lens so that I could make the choy in the foreground look bigger, more prominent, but also they get stretched out by perspective distortion. So they start leaning, they appear to be leaning in diagonally. And those leaning in diagonal lines are helping to lead the eye from foreground to background. Then I had to think about visual separation because I had some backlit choya in the middle ground, and I needed to make sure that the choya that were backlit in the foreground didn't visually overlap with the middle ground. I needed those to be separate so that I had these separate areas. And I also needed the middle ground choya to be separate from the mountains so that I've got distinct foreground, middle ground, and background. So I chose my position very carefully to make the choya bigger, and then I chose my camera height very carefully to create that sufficient visual separation. And then all of these shapes working together create a lot of visual energy. There's the illusion of depth in this photograph, but also the illusion of energy. So you've got all these shapes that are leaning in, creating these diagonal lines that are all pointing the viewer to that same spot where the sun is rising in the background, acting as the point of interest. So the sunburst is pulling the viewer to that spot. All the radiating diagonal spikes of that sunburst are creating these converging diagonal lines that are pulling the viewer to the spot. All the choya cacti are leaning in, creating lines converging on that spot. So all of these lessons working together to create a dynamic composition. It's visually complex. It's a wide angle scene. There's a lot of stuff going on in there, but by thinking carefully about the shapes and visual separation and creating motion and energy in my composition, I was able to simplify the chaos and instead create a very bold, compelling visual design. Okay, so a few final thoughts. And to make sure that you pay attention and always think about these final thoughts, my composition enforcing lioness is here to make sure that you stay on the straight and narrow. These are just a few of my favorite techniques, but none of these are ironclad rules. There's no such thing as the rules of composition. There are only tools that you can use as needed. And remember, a snapshot shows the world what your camera sees. When you point your camera at something interesting and just take a photo and don't think about it, you're just showing the world what your camera sees. But when you take the time to create an artistic, compelling visual design, if you make a composition, you show the world what you see as an artist. And finally, if you can see it, you can do it. And what I mean by that is if you're listening to my lecture and you understand what I'm talking about, you say, oh yeah, I see what he's talking about. I can see how that makes a shape that creates a leading line. If you can see that, nothing will stop you from doing it. You might need some practice, but if you can see it, you can do it. Finally, a quote from me. I'm trying to make this a thing, so feel free to pass this on. A photograph should say as much about the artist as it does about the subject. You are sharing your unique creative vision with the world. And only if you think carefully about the visual design will you be able to fully translate your own experience for the viewer. So if you want to learn more from me, head over to photomasters.com. Check out my free photography webinar. Lots of free and premium resources there to help you become the best photographer you can be. You can learn more about me and my photography going to my personal website, ianplant.com. You can also learn about my photo workshops and tours on either site. And if you want to learn more about composition, particular landscape composition, every year I host masterclass workshops in Badlands National Park in South Dakota. It is my favorite place in the world to photograph. And my clients really enjoy this experience. I've had a number of clients who have come back more than once to this workshop. Even had one guy who's done the workshop 3 times. So it's just a really fun experience. We chase storms and or stars depending on conditions. So it's a wonderful place to do a lot of really interesting photography. And so I've reached the end of my presentation and I can stop my share. And if anyone's got any questions, I'm sorry, there was probably some questions that were coming in during the presentation, but I just keep going. So I'm sure Joe never had a chance to interrupt. So now you can hit me up.
Okay, Ian. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. Thank you. Frank, are you there to ask your question regarding the drone?
Yeah, and I saw quite a few of your drone images, and I'm just wondering what kind of drone or how many different drones you have.
Yeah, so currently I'm flying 2 drones. They're both made by DJI, and they're the world drone leader. And so one of my drones is their newest flagship model, which is the Mavic 4 Pro. And then I've got the Mavic 4 Pro's little brother, which is the Mini 5 Pro. So the Mavic's pretty big and robust drone, really good when you need to fly long distances or if there's heavy wind. The Mini kind of fits in the palm of your hand. So it's really great as my backup drone. And if I'm traveling and space is tight, I also like bringing the Mini because it's so small and lightweight. And another cool thing about the Mini is that it is sufficiently small so that for a lot of country, it doesn't require any sort of registration. So it's great, especially if you're going to places that have a bit more drone restrictions than the US, because you don't have to worry about flying that drone in most places. It's perfectly okay. You don't have to register it in local jurisdictions. It's just too small for anyone really to care about. And it's actually a wonderful drone. I sometimes use it as my primary drone for a lot of things.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Another question came in on a email, and that was, do you ever use the remove tool to take something out of the frame that's blocking your flow?
Oh yeah, yeah. So certainly I'll do a little bit of scene cleanup if I find it necessary. And sometimes you'll have some sort of distracting visual element. A little bit of removal can sometimes be a good thing. Usually for me, it's stuff that's kind of at the edges of the image frame, like distracting elements that you're trying to keep out of your composition, but you can't quite get there. And so maybe a little bit of cropping or just a little bit of cleanup can help with that. Usually though, like if it's something really small and distracting, I'll get rid of it. No big deal. Like, sometimes there might be like a footprint in the scene or something like that. But if it's something bigger, if it's something that's kind of more like a more permanent part of the scene, instead of removing it, I'll just try to tone it down so it's less visible. So if it's bright or colorful, I might desaturate it or make it a little bit darker so that it's not noticeable to the viewer, or, I'm basically just de-emphasizing it. So usually I'm doing that more than I am removing stuff from the scene. If I'm doing removal, it's usually just like little small things. Like sometimes when you're photographing, like let's say on the beach, there might be a few bright shells in the sand, like white shells that are they're really tiny, but they're sticking out, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. And so, yeah, I'll clean that sort of thing up.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
Hey, Ian, this is Dave Marchetto. Just an amazing presentation, very inspirational.
Thank you.
And I have two questions, Ian. One is regarding black and white photography, landscape in particular. I don't know if you can get to your magnificent photo of the Grand Tetons, but if you can, I can ask the question there. Otherwise,
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
just answer it, ask it in general.
Let me go ahead and share my screen, and let me go back to it.
There's so many that you showed us that are just absolutely remarkable.
Thank you.
I was particularly moved by the Grand Tetons. So, Ian,
Yeah.
Regarding black and white imagery, if you took this in black and white, would it change the composition?
Great question. I think this image, it's the same composition in color or black and white. So sometimes if you're you're going to convert to black and white, you're going to approach composition differently because you're looking for contrast. Here, because of that visual contrast between the shadow and light areas of the image and the blue and the gold, I think this would convert really nicely to black and white because you could shift the blue color channels and make that darker, maybe make the gold, like the yellows in the image, brighter during the conversion, and you can help tease out that contrast in the final monochrome image. So I think this image would be the exact same in black and white.
And you prefer color most of the time, as your presentation shows. You're not favoring black and white for sure, and you don't gravitate toward it, I suppose.
Yeah, I have shot color for most of my career. I do some black and white. Recently, I engaged in what I call the monochrome project, which was basically me going through 20 years of my digital image archives, all the color photographs I've taken during that time, and sorting through them to see if some of them that I had previously overlooked because they weren't very good in color, if they would make nice black and white photos. So if you go to my website, I've actually got a monochrome gallery, which is the result of this year-long project to scour my color images for photos that would convert nicely to black and white. So yeah, black and white's not something I do often, but I do it on occasion.
Oh, it's just remarkable, Ian. And I just have one more question. I hope I'm not taking too much time here.
Yes.
In your tours or your client trips, I'm just kind of curious how the after hours work on that. Do you debrief? Do you discuss images? Or do you pretty much, do other things?
It depends. So my photo workshops are teaching workshops, and for those we have extensive classroom work. So we spend a lot of time in the field, but in the middle of the day, we will review images. We'll talk about compositional theory. We'll do Lightroom tutorials, processing tutorials. So yeah, there's a lot of time spent with clients doing critique and review and other things. On my photo tours, I try to fit that in whenever I can, but depending on the tour, sometimes a tour is moving around a lot, and so there might not be a lot of downtime. But I do try to make that available to my clients for every experience I have, whether it's photo workshop or a photo tour. It's just with the photo workshops, the teaching workshops, definitely there's more opportunity for that.
Thanks, Ian. Really an amazing presentation. We have so many guests that come to us, and your presentation today is truly exceptional.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad you liked it.
May I ask a brief question?
You may.
Okay, I'm just wondering about the extent to which you adjust colors. And I've got specific reference to those 3 pictures in the swamp where you had the very brilliant orange leaves.
Mm-hmm.
The first of those looked as if you had desaturated every color besides orange.
Actually, so I, with my color work, I tend to be pretty subtle with my color adjustments. I do look for scenes that might have a lot of native color. And usually I'm not tweaking the colors that much, or I might actually be desaturating the colors if I think that they're a little too hot in the raw image. For that particular image, I don't think that I desaturated the contrary colors. If I can remember what I did during the processing is I shifted the overall white balance to a slightly cooler side, knowing that the cooler tones in the image would render a bit more bluish as a result. And so that was done intentionally to create a complementary color scheme. So I knew that those cooler tones would be opposite the warmer tones of those really brilliant orange leaves. And when you've got opposite colors next to each other, they tend to make each other appear more vibrant. So they lend themselves to creating a more vibrant color palette. But it's the juxtaposition of the colors that's creating that effect more so than playing around with the individual colors.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Okay,
All
I
right.
think that's Ian. Thank you. As others have commented, this is an excellent presentation. You've taken a very wide topic and you brought it down to something that we could digest and incorporate at least some of the ideas into our own portfolios as we go forward. So it was an excellent presentation, and thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I had a great time talking with you and answering your questions. And so I will sign off for now, but I'm wishing you good luck and great light. And hopefully I'll see you guys again, either virtually or even better in real life. Bye-bye.
Great.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ian. Bye now.
Thanks, Ian.
Okay. That was a great presentation. That was really good. So I apologize for the technical difficulty, and I don't know exactly where it lies, and I'm going to be doing research on that before our next session comes up. So thank you, everybody, for being here, and we appreciate it, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
It was a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. It was great.
Okay. Frank, did he answer your question about the drones?
Yeah, he did. I really
Yeah.
have to upgrade to the
Oh, no.
newest one that I can't buy.
Okay.
Still not available in the United States, so I'd like to know how we got it.
Okay. We had 36 people attending, and that attendance stayed up for almost the whole session.
Excellent.
Okay, very good. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to sign off for tonight.
Bye now.
Take care.
Bye now.
Take care.
Mark. Mark, you still there, Mark? Mark Abano, are you still there? No? Okay, see you guys.